We are really pleased to host Join IRPE talk. And for our seminar today, we have Wodtke from the professor of sociology at University of Chicago, and also the associate director, I wrote it down since it's long, of the Stone Center for Research on Wealth Inequality and Mobility. And you get to ask questions whenever you want because from Chicago up there. So whenever you have questions, you get to ask them, and I'll turn things over to you. Thanks for joining us.
All right, thank you. I think I'm known as one of the more obnoxious interrupters in Chicago. Back here. So, I mean, thanks so much for the invitation today. It's always a real pleasure to come back to Madison. Building is exactly how I remember it. So today I'm gonna share a brand new project of yours, tentatively titled Poor Neighborhoods, Bad Schools, with an emphasis on the question mark there. And this is a joint project with Kaylee White, who's a researcher at the U Chicago Education Lab. You guys are the first to see this talk, so I'm definitely eager to hear your thoughts and feedback. And I guess I should also caution that this is very much a work in progress. And when I agreed to this date, I was sort of hoping that I would have more progress. But in any case, I figured you guys would rather see something new rather than something old that I'm working on now. Especially considering that this is based on Department of Education data, so who knows if it'll still exist in a few months. Maybe this is the only group that I'll ever see the control. So what's the motivation for this study? So first, there are just large and persistent disparities in academic achievement between students from high and low poverty neighborhoods. So, nationally, UCLS students, from a high poverty neighborhood, greater than 20% poverty rate, score on average about half a standard deviation lower on reading and math assessments in elementary school compared to their counterpart in lower poverty neighborhoods. And, one of the most common assumptions, whether from scholars, policymakers, or just in general public discourse, is that these disparities are partly, perhaps even largely, driven by differences in school quality. I think it's almost become a cultural axiom in the U.S. that kids in poor neighborhoods attend bad schools. And the differences in school quality are at least partly to blame for the achievement gaps that we observe across neighborhoods. And schools serving poor neighborhoods are also commonly singled out, for intervention, overhaul, even sometimes, complete closure, as in Chicago, in an effort, oftentimes, to improve students' outcomes and close achievement gaps. But sort of going to make a broad statement across a wide range of literature. I would say that the empirical evidence, to support some of these assumptions, certainly strong forms of the assumptions, is pretty thin, I think. not all prior studies find especially stark differences between the schools serving high and low poverty neighborhoods. And I would say that, much of the literature suffers from a reliance on kind of a small number of fairly crude and I would say sometimes dubious proxies for school quality, like indicators of student efficiency levels, school expenditures, staff qualifications, and so on. But we know that school environments are incredibly complex, and measuring their quality is exceedingly difficult. Especially when relying on kind of a handful of basic indicators. And I can actually single out my own prior research for criticism here as an example. So, a few years ago, I worked on a paper with a student of mine, Matt Parps, where we looked at differences in access to quality schools between high and low poverty neighborhoods, and to do that, some pretty common proxy measures like free lunch participation, teacher pupil ratios, and reports of classroom disorder and so forth. More recently, I tried to improve on these measures by incorporating data on reading and math value added. But even with these measures, I think there are still some pretty significant limitations, right? So value added estimates, often suffer from low reliability and can be pretty unstable from year to year, and only capture reading and math. Yeah.
Maybe you're getting there, but can you say theoretically or empirically what we know about what makes for a high quality school?
I am getting there, but probably in a way that would be unsatisfying for you, which is that I would say that if you ask 10 different education researchers, social education people, you're likely to get 10 different answers. So my colleague Steve Rodenbush would tell you that double dose algebra is hugely important, especially for lower income students. And he would also emphasize, say the importance of a strong administration and very high expectations. But if you, ask somebody like Doug Downey, I think, you would get a different answer. So, in this paper, my approach is to kind of leave that question open in a way. But you'll have to tell me if it's works. So in any case, in my own prior work, I've tried to, use different proxies for school quality, all with limitations, or, to quote a not so subtle anonymous reviewer from one of these papers, the problem is that the measures of better schools used are terrible. And, they're not exactly wrong, pretty harsh, but not wrong. I happen to think, these papers do a better job of measuring school quality than some of the other work in this area, but it's still just very challenging to kind of operationalize such a complex concept in a compelling and comprehensive way. But so to kind of get back to the theoretical motivation here, as I mentioned earlier, it's commonly hypothesized that neighborhood poverty is closely tied to school quality. So, this hypothesis stems from, what's known in sociology as institutional resource theory, which in simple terms, argues that, children in high poverty neighborhoods, tend to perform worse academically because they're more likely to attend low quality schools. And this is because, in the US, public school assignment is often geographically determined, or travel constraints, even when it's not geographically determined, tend to, engender a strong connection between the neighborhood a child lives in and the school they attend. And this creates a connection between the socioeconomic composition of neighborhoods and schools. And schools serving a higher proportion of low-income students are thought to suffer from educational deficiencies. So, these schools enroll more students with, lower measured achievement even before they start school, and a higher incidence of behavioral problems. So they're thought to experience kind of a slower pace of instruction, more classroom disruptions, more difficulty attracting and retaining high quality teachers, among many other challenges. But beyond some of these more kind of concrete speculations or suggestions, this theory and other related arguments tend to be very vague when it comes to defining and, in particular, operationalizing school quality, which is an incredibly amorphous concept. So in this study, I'm going to define school quality conceptually as some combination of its investment and consumption value. So both very broadly construed here. So by investment value, I just mean the long-term benefits that the school imparts to its students. So things like greater knowledge, more advanced skills, higher earnings, better health, stronger social networks, and so forth. While consumption value here just refers to kind of the more immediate or like intrinsic gratification that might while attending school, from learning and so forth. So the challenge is that trying to directly measure school quality, right, is some combination of its investment and consumption value is basically impossible. Consumption benefits are, pretty subjective and difficult to quantify. And, the investment benefits of schooling are also very difficult to measure because there's many different possible investment benefits, and they often can take years to materialize. So basically, as a result, we're always forced to rely on proxies for school quality. And in prior research, school quality has been, proxied in a variety of different ways. So one common approach is to focus on school inputs, like composition of the student body or the resources available to a school. Another way is to look at the characteristics internal to the school, such as its curriculum, its instructional practices, its academic climate, what economists might refer to as the school's technology and its production function that transforms inputs into outputs. And then more recently, right, there's been this kind of increasing shift towards measuring school quality in terms of outputs, specifically, kind of short-term outputs like test scores. And this is typically, done using metrics like value added or other kind of related indicators of school effectiveness. But even after we kind of, break school quality down into some, function of inputs, technology, outputs, we immediately kind of encounter a lot of additional complexity. So if we just take school resources as, one example here, right? Like this category itself encompasses many different dimensions, such as funding levels, staffing levels, staff qualifications and training, physical infrastructure, the building, the rooms, instructional technology, and so forth. And we could keep unpacking even these finer grained categories even further, almost like kind of a branching taxonomic tree of sorts. And each of these many dimensions of a school may vary across neighborhoods and influence students in complex ways. And so I think any attempt to operationalize school quality using just kind of a few convenient, or to be less charitable, cherry-picked measures from this big branching taxonomic tree runs the risk of either mischaracterizing or incompletely capturing how neighborhood and school environments are related and how their nexus may contribute to achievement disparities. So in this study, a lot of this paper is just descriptive, and then the more prescriptive or causal analyses, I'll caution, are kind of preliminary and have some issues that we can talk through. I have solutions to those issues, but didn't have time to implement them. But basically, first in the study, we're just going to investigate how school environments differ between high and low poverty neighborhoods when they're conceptualized and operationalized as comprehensively as I think current data allow. And then second, we're also just going to consider, the extent to which any differences that we observe in school environments, right, when operationalized along these many different dimensions, whether they're associated, just merely associated with achievement gaps between students from high and low poverty neighborhoods. And then finally, we're also going to attempt to estimate how different hypothetical interventions to equalize school environments across neighborhoods might influence, hopefully reduce achievement gaps. So, right, answering these questions poses some difficult methodological challenges. So the first challenge, as I've already hinted at, is that measuring school quality is not easy. It's a highly multidimensional concept, which makes it hard to capture comprehensively using proxies. The second challenge is that, given these many different dimensions of school quality, it can be very tricky to model their relationship with student achievement, as it almost certainly involves complex forms of nonlinearity and interaction. So the presence of sort of different features of a school environment, right? If you might have a state-of-the-art curriculum, but that's not going to help if it's not delivered by a talented teacher. There's also, I think, an argument to be made that school quality is an individually contingent concept, meaning like what makes a good school for me, like UW-Madison, might not be a good school for somebody else. Like somebody from Florida, right? Or needs that warm weather, right, to get in the headspace to absorb the amazing stuff going on in classrooms here. And so then the third challenge just involves identifying, the effects of interventions aimed at equalizing school environments across neighborhoods. This requires strong assumptions, particularly about the absence of unobserved confounding factors that can't be empirically verified and are difficult to satisfy by design. So In this study, I'm gonna try and tackle the first challenge by using more than 170 different measures of the school environment. Essentially, just about everything the Department of Education's flagship survey on elementary schools thought to ask about them. To address the second challenge, I'm going to model the relationship between these many different characteristics of schools with student achievement using a flexible machine learning approach that's capable of pretty accurately approximating complex relationships in high dimensional data. And then I'm going to try to address the third challenge by focusing on a slightly less conventional set of estimands that are comparatively easier to identify, although still not in any way easy to identify. And then by adjusting for a pretty comprehensive set of putative confounders and conducting a sensitivity analysis of possible bias due to unobserved confounding. So we use data from the early childhood longitudinal study kindergarten class of 2011, or ECLSK or ECHLSK. And this is based on a large national sample of students and collected a pretty detailed information about their achievement and the characteristics of their schools from kindergarten through 5th grade. And as I mentioned, we're going to try and operationalize school quality, using a vector of 171 different characteristics of the school environment, here denoted by bold S. And so this includes 11 measures of school composition, capturing student and staff demographics, 41 measures of school resources, which capture things like funding, class sizes, staffing levels, and qualifications, the quality and availability of different facilities and teaching technologies. It also includes 91 measures of different instructional practices, as we're referring to them, which include the use of particular teaching methods, curricular content, use of different assessment practices, and classroom management strategies. 26 measures of a school's climate, which are based on indicators of staff morale, perceived support from parents, the community, administrators, indicators about the communication between staff and parents in the administration. And then finally, we also include 2 indicators of effectiveness, which are fairly conventional estimates of school value added in reading and math, specifically during 1st grade. So then we measure neighborhood poverty here very simply, just using a binary indicator X, denoting whether a child lives in a census tract with a poverty rate greater than 20%. And then our outcome of interest here is a child's IRT score on a reading assessment administered at the end of 3rd grade. We also looked at math scores and tests administered in 4th and 5th grade. And things are similar, so I'm just going to show you this today. Yeah. Hey.
Good to see you. Well, Professor.
That's right.
Man, I feel old. Can you say a little bit about the decision to put test score levels on the left-hand side rather than the value-added measures on the left-hand side?
So yes, I'm sort of thinking about value added as in first grade is again like a proxy for all the unobserved possible contributors to school quality in a school that we don't get from, you know, demographics, resources, instruction, and so on. So it's sort of like, even though we have, you know, like 169 different characteristics here, that's probably not even all the things that, you know, might contribute to school quality in some way. And so one possible approach to getting at the unobserved dimensions of school quality is using value added in first grade. And so then obviously, because we're basically using test scores at one particular point in elementary school to measure school quality, right? We wouldn't want to look at, say, like test scores at the end of first grade, or there's going to be like a nearly mechanical relationship between those two things, similar to like a reflection problem. So that's the rationale for going out to test scores at end of third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade.
It is a different sort of thing than the other four, right? In the sense that in principle, the policymaker can manipulate 1 through 4. That's a little harder with climate, but in a way that they can't easily manipulate effectiveness, right? They can try.
Exactly. Yeah. And part of I mean, I don't have a whole lot to show you guys today in terms of the more like sort of interventional effects here, but, you know, part of our rationale for trying to kind of disaggregate these different measures into, you know, composition, resources, instruction, climate, effectiveness is so that we could potentially look, right, at how like interventions on things that are conceivably stuff that we could intervene upon, unlike value added, which is just like a black box, right? And so we could look at like, all right, well, like what if we equalized distribution of you know, students of different SES backgrounds across schools, or what if we just, you know, equalized resources come what may on everything else, right? And so that's part of the rationale for kind of, you know, these broader categories of similar measures, right? But we also just want to first answer the question, you know, how do schools differ across neighborhoods? And I think, you know, value added tells us something important there that we could miss from these, right? And then also we're just interested in kind of more the theoretical question of like, you know, what roles do differences in schools play in these achievement gaps? In which case, I think that if you don't have something like this, again, the concern is that even though we have all these measures, right, because I think people don't have a very good idea of what contributes to school quality, especially when what's a good school for me might not be for you, right? We're just missing something there. So that's how I'm thinking about it. Does that make sense?
Oh, that's a reasonable answer.
Okay. And then in terms of, you know, when we get into some of the interventional analyses, we also consider measure a set of confounders at baseline, here denoted by C. And so these include, you know, things like race, gender, birth weight, age, education, marital status, employment status of a primary caregiver, family income, measures of parenting skills of the caregiver, levels of cognitive stimulation provided at the home, and then also a baseline measures of child test scores taken at the fall of kindergarten, as well as baseline measures of behavioral problems, ability to focus, and parental rated health of the child.
Question?
Yeah.
So how come the child characteristics are a baseline covariate and not a different input? Right, if we were looking at like the college quality literature, right, then the student test scores would be one of the key inputs and into the production function of whatever, right? Here you've got the characteristics of the staff, instructional staff, but not the characteristics of the kids as an input. And
Well, so we do. Here
then
we
what's
do
the difference
have-
between
we do have
S1
a
and the
bunch of-
baseline covariate?
We do have a bunch of measures of student composition among the whole school. Right, so in that sense, we're thinking of, the characteristics of all students at the school is an input.
I see. Okay, so this is the individual level variables just to suck up residual variance.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you including kids with IEPs or disabilities?
Yes, they're in here. Well, so we don't know if they have an IEP for fall kindergarten, but we do have an indicator that they've been diagnosed with a list of different disabilities.
Would you have the other measures like test scores for them?
I think it depends on the disability and if it's, so for some of them, no, but for some of them, yes. And I couldn't tell you off the top of my head how that decision logic works.
Vary by state.
If you're
Well,
using
so the test scores here are administered by the surveyors as part of the ECLSK, right? But they're still, like if the child is like vision or hearing impaired, I'm not sure how they would carry it out.
These are all public non-charter schools.
What's that?
They're all public non-charter schools.
No, there are, just based on when the survey was conducted, it's largely public schools, but there are charter and private schools in the state.
Parents selecting into certain schools.
Yep. Yeah. So, and then to just kind of get a appropriate temporal ordering of these different measurements, we measure what we're calling our baseline characteristics of students and their families, and then the poverty rate of their neighborhoods at the fall of kindergarten. And then we're measuring our vector of school characteristics over the first grade school year. And then our outcomes are all measured at the end of third grade or later. And so then basically, our analysis just kind of is in three parts here. So, first, we just estimate differences in the characteristics of schools attended by students from high and low poverty neighborhoods to give a general sense of how these environments differ. And then in the second part, I'm just going to perform a descriptive decomposition of the observed gap in test scores between students from high and low poverty neighborhoods, where the goal is just to evaluate kind of whether and how this achievement gap is just associated with differences in school characteristics across neighborhoods. And then in part three, we're going to try to estimate the impact of hypothetical interventions aimed at kind of equalizing different dimensions of the school environment across neighborhoods. Yeah.
Quick clarification. So it doesn't matter that the schools may not be in the neighborhoods themselves. It just is where do kids from high and low poverty neighborhoods
Exactly.
actually go?
Yeah. Okay, so first, I'm just gonna show you guys a bunch of standardized mean differences for each of our school characteristics. Comparing students who live in high and low poverty neighborhoods. And we looked at a bunch of other measures of, like effect size here, and including, a number that are kind of tailored specifically for binary ordinal indicators, you know, which we have many of here. And, you know, they all yielded a very similar pattern. So I'm just going to stick with something simple and familiar here. So this figure shows observed differences in school composition. And, you know, as I think we'd all expect, school composition differs substantially by neighborhood. Poverty, where students from high poverty neighborhoods attend schools with, you know, many more peers who are free lunch eligible, Black, Hispanic, English language learners, and conversely, they have far less exposure to white peers and staff. But there's, you know, few meaningful differences in the number of students classified as special ed or who are in a gifted and talented program. Yeah.
Are you operationalizing high or low poverty?
Whether or not a student lives in a census tract with a poverty rate greater than 20%. So big differences in school composition. By contrast, much smaller differences in school resources by neighborhood poverty. So children from high poverty neighborhoods are, as we'd expect, more likely to attend Title I schools. And partly because of that, there are no major differences across several different indicators of expenditures per pupil. You know, there are also more ESL teachers and translators in high poverty schools, which reflects their higher proportion of English language learners. And in terms of staffing levels and qualifications, there are also generally few differences. Teachers in high poverty schools tend to have slightly less experience. And the facilities and technology are also rated fairly similarly across these groups, with only multi-use rooms receiving somewhat lower marks in high poverty schools. Similarly, these figures show only small differences in school curriculum content and instructional practices by neighborhood poverty level, as do these figures here. So, you know, across 91 different measures of curriculum content and different instructional practices, I'd say all these gaps are pretty muted. And if you dive into each of the individual measures here, it's not really clear whether, you know, schools serving one versus another student population are really doing anything that might immediately jump off the page to us as like higher versus lower quality. Yeah.
How much is this pattern driven by the dichotomous treatment of neighborhood poverty? Like if you had done perciles or quartiles and taken high and low that aren't right next to each other, do you see a different pattern?
So we looked at, so far we haven't chopped up the distribution, you know, to like isolate the higher and lower tails, but we have looked at like a variety of different cut points, right? So getting into like higher and higher poverty neighborhoods. And we've also looked at like multi-dimensional measures of poverty, you know, based on not just the poverty rate, but, you know, the educational composition of a neighborhood, unemployment, family structure, and so forth, and chopped that up to different thresholds. And I would say the pattern is very similar here, but I think that, you know, what you're intimating is probably right, that when we get way out to the upper tail, meaning the very wealthy, high income neighborhoods, and compare them against the rest, my priors would be that we would see larger differences. But here I'm kind of focused on the bottom of the distribution.
We don't necessarily think of a neighborhood with like 18% poverty as a low poverty neighborhood, right? And then the difference between a neighborhood with 18 versus 22% poverty,
Yeah,
I would imagine it would look like this.
yeah, well, so I mean, the one thing we did do that might be more along the lines of what you're interested in here is we did just like estimate the standardized marginal effect of continuous poverty rate on each of these indicators, right? And those dot and whisker plots also look pretty similar to here, but we just did that kind of naively, like assuming linearity. And if this is a story about, say, like, very wealthy neighborhoods, we also probably wouldn't catch that there. So here are differences in our indicators of school climate. So here the differences are a little bit larger, but still not huge. So children from high poverty neighborhoods are, significantly less likely to attend schools where teachers feel supported by the administration, by parents, by the community. Teachers here also tend to have lower morale, as indicated in kind of teachers reporting that they don't enjoy their job, wouldn't choose the same career again. And there's also slightly more classroom disorder in schools serving students from high poverty neighborhoods. But these are, I think, smaller than most people would anticipate. And there's generally little variation in exposure to theft, bullying, fighting, and so forth. And then last, but not least, these are just density plots of value added here in reading during first grade between these two groups. And it also suggests pretty small differences in how schools are, in part, if we believe the validity of a kind of conventional value added estimates, like lag dependent variable models. These would suggest that these schools are kind of imparting reading skills during first grade in a pretty similar way between these two groups. But this goes back to kind of your question. I'm not sure how much I would read into the noisiness in these tails, but it looks like there's potentially, right, a greater frequency, slightly greater frequency of schools in poor neighborhoods doing a really bad job, even if most of them are okay. But I'm not sure I would read too closely into this. Yes.
The estimates and the figure been subjected to one or another shrinkage estimator?
Yeah. So, depends on exactly what you mean by shrinkage, but these are from basically school random effects models, right? So there's like a shrinkage implicit in that, right? Yeah.
On average, how many kids per school?
In these value added models, it's like 19. Yeah.
Look at the difference in share of first year teachers across schools.
Sorry, just a little louder.
Could you look at the difference in shares of first year teachers across schools? I think on the first measure, maybe like the inputs measure, you have something about tenure. There was like a big difference. And then classroom climate is, I think, also related to first year teachers.
I think that yes, we could construct a measure of the proportion of teachers in their first year. Yeah, right now, we have what was in those plots was like years of teaching experience and then years of teaching experience at this particular school, which is the tenure measure. Yeah. Those measures don't differ very much, but yeah, I mean, I take your point. We could look at an indicator of like a clearer indicator of inexperience. Okay, so next, I just want to examine whether these differences in school characteristics are associated with gaps in student achievement. And so here, we're just performing a descriptive decomposition, kind of breaking down the observed achievement gap between students in high and low poverty neighborhoods into kind of a series of mean differences that are adjusted or standardized for different sets of the school characteristics that I outlined previously. And so we estimate these adjusted gaps using a super learner, which is a ensemble machine learning method that just combines predictions from a number of different models. In our case, we use just a conventional linear model, and then also a random forest and a gradient boosted tree. And you know, with these kind of non or semi-parametric fitting algorithms like random forests and gradient boosted trees, you know, super learners with enough data can approximate pretty complex regression surfaces with high dimensional sets of predictors, like all our different measures of school characteristics. And the advantage of using a super learner rather than kind of any one of these algorithms or parametric models taken separately is that it's combined predictions across the many different learners in the ensemble are guaranteed to be at least as accurate as the single best fitting learner in the ensemble, but can potentially be more accurate than anyone taken in isolation. Yeah.
And maybe the answer is doesn't matter for what I want to do, but I would press you a little bit on what you think the underlying production function looks like in a couple of senses. One sense is you've sorted, as I understand it, the many variables that you have into the 5 input categories based on a priori notions of what goes together, and which is in a way interesting, given that you're then going to be super flexible here with the machine learning. And then, are you thinking about the variables within each of the 5 categories as proxies for a single underlying dimension, or are you thinking that there's an underlying production function and all 190 variables or whatever it is are arguments in that production function, and that many, if not most, of both the first partials and the cross partials are not zero?
I think closer to the latter, but with the, where's but with perhaps a qualification that I do kind of envision on a short time horizon, some kind of forward flowing causal structure here, whereby, you know, the composition of a school shapes the resources that it has access to. Now, that gets complicated when you start looking at longer time horizons, but both of these in turn shape the curricular content and instructional practices. All of these shape the school climate, and kind of together, these things shape effectiveness. But how they do that, I'm agnostic on. And the reason, part of the reason for the machine learning is that I kind of want to remain agnostic on that. And then later, it's also partly that, like, once we introduce a bunch of baseline student characteristics, I want to allow for the possibility that basically, like, a school's production function, so to speak, varies from student to student, right? And, like, you know, presence of ESL teachers could be very important for ESL students, right? But not for others. And so how we think of that is some reflection of school quality, right? Like, we can't do that in education. without considering who the schools are serving. So does that answer your question?
Those arrows that you had in your verbal description are sort of not implicit in the empirical strategy, as I understand it, other than the sense that you're doing, at least initially, separately for S1 through S5.
So for the descriptive decomposition, no. And I think in my slides, I'm only going to show you a decomposition where we like successively. So we adjust for this, then we adjust for both, then all these three, and so on, right? But we also did it where we just looked at each one of these separately. And I can tell you that things don't actually look that different, which is surprising to us. I only have a little to show you today from a causal decomposition, but in that, we do take account of the assumed sort of causal priority I just outlined, meaning that like when, for instance, I'm trying to estimate the impact of like equalizing the distribution of curricular content and instructional practices across neighborhoods, we are controlling for things we've assumed are upstream of that, like school resources and composition, right? So it shows up there, not in the descriptive decomposition. So, so here are the results from just the descriptive decomposition. So the first row here just shows the observed gap in test scores indicates that students from high poverty neighborhoods are scoring about half a standard deviation below those in low poverty neighborhoods on their third grade reading assessments. So the second row shows the test score gap now adjusted for differences in school composition as measured by our multiple different indicators of composition. And, it shows that the gap is now reduced by about 2/3, right? Which indicates here that school composition is strongly associated with differences in test scores across neighborhoods. This isn't really surprising given the strong relationship between neighborhoods and school demographics and the well-documented association of family SES and so forth with test scores. What is perhaps a little bit more surprising is that after adjusting for school composition, further adjustments for resources, instructional practices, curricular content, climate, effectiveness don't really move the gap in test scores at all. And like I mentioned, if we were to just consider each of these in isolation, this looks, I should say, the figure looks a bit different, but in terms of which are moving the needle on the gap, it's almost entirely composition and not much on these other characteristics, which is pretty much a direct consequence of all the dot whisker plots I just showed you, where differences in resources, practices, climate, and effectiveness are just much more muted across neighborhoods than our composition. Yeah.
What do you look at the confidence intervals?
So these are just bootstrapped. Yeah. So I wouldn't, and also there's a possibility of finite sample bias here, which I'll talk a little bit about later, because these are just like plug-in ML estimates. We have a pretty large sample, but the finite sample bias in some of these ML estimators is like really slow to decay. So there is a risk of some finite sample bias here, and also no guarantee that these have like 95% coverage. So one of the things I was hoping to have fixed before I presented here, I do have, I have a debiased machine learning approach and set of estimating equations for these descriptive gaps and for the interventional gaps that I'll show you in a second worked out, but didn't have time to implement them. So, yeah.
School composition is just student composition or also teacher?
Also teacher, yeah. And I'm still not sure exactly where to put teacher and staff characteristics in our taxonomic tree, whether or not that's a compositional feature of the school or a resource. You know, depending on what you read about effects of teacher race and gender on students, it's sometimes, I think, very much conceptualized as a resource. But anyway, that's also, yeah.
Are you able to separate out each of the individual components of school composition to see which one moves the needle more?
Here, no. Well, I have a slide that'll tell you something about that. But no, we didn't attempt a decomposition where we tried to look at the like incremental, what an incremental adjustment on each measure does to the gap. Okay, so these, remind me what time this ends? 1:30?
1:30.
1:30, okay. All right, so the gaps I just showed you, right, like it's just kind of a demographic exercise, a standardization exercise. They definitely don't have any kind of causal interpretation. So, you know, to get at a more kind of a set of interventional gaps, I'm going to show you a couple estimates where basically what we're targeting is a set of stochastic post-intervention gaps. So like the one shown on the slide here, where the script S here represents a random draw from the marginal distribution of all our measured school characteristics. And so this estimate basically captures the gap in test scores, right, that would persist under an intervention that kind of resembles like a strict school lottery, right, where students are just randomly assigned to the existing set of schools, regardless of their neighborhood or background. And so we can identify an estimate like this under an assumption that, you know, a student's potential outcomes are independent of their observed school characteristics, conditional on neighborhood poverty, and our baseline covariates. And essentially this means that school choice, conditional on student background, baseline test scores, family characteristics, and neighborhood poverty rate, is school selection is sort of as good as random, conditional on those things. That's a strong assumption, could very well be violated. We try and do a little bit of a sensitivity analysis to assess kind of the robustness of our results to departures from that assumption. So to estimate these types of post-intervention gaps, we use, for now, a better way to do this, we talk about in the Q&A. We basically, again, we train a super learner for the conditional mean of our outcome given our baseline covariates, neighborhood poverty, and our vector of school characteristics. So similar to what I was doing previously, but now conditioning on a whole bunch of baseline controls. And then for each observation, we replace their observed school characteristics with a vector of these characteristics randomly sampled from their empirical distribution, empirical marginal distribution in the ECLSK. And then we plug that sampled vector into the superlearner, predict the outcome for each case, and then repeat that step many, many times, average all of those predictions together, and then average those resulting quantities across sample members. And taking the difference between them gives us a kind of an estimate for our post-intervention gap here. Yeah.
Clarify quickly about the sampling from distribution of the S's. You said the margin, so you're on each characteristic and separately from
No, entire vectors.
or the entire vector from the joint distribution.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question, and maybe this applies to the other models as well, but are you using a geographically adjusted poverty measure? So if you're not, then that kind of affects the way that you interpret the results, the top and the bottom, because it implies that you're comparing like everyone in a low poverty state to everyone in a high poverty state.
What do you mean by geographically adjusted?
Are you using a relative or an absolute poverty measure to?
We're using essentially like the census official poverty measure, right? So there's lots of problems with that. I can tell you that like however you define poverty in this sample, whether it's with that certainly flawed measure of poverty or whether it's educational composition of the neighborhood, unemployment rate, family structure, some combination of all of those. The general patterns that I've already shown you and will show you are very similar. So I don't think that this is like a measurement artifact, if that's what you're getting at.
Well, I guess the reason I'm asking is like for this experiment, right? The implication would be like you're trying to find what's the effect, like race to the top, right? How can we make outcomes better for kids based on, these characteristics? And if you're not doing state specific estimations, right? If each model isn't conducted within a state, which I don't think it is. Right?
So we conditioned on like census geography or census divisions here.
Oh, okay, you did.
Yeah, and whether or not, so the analysis is not fully stratified by those divisions, but like the way that like the data adaptive methods like random forest or boosted trees work is that like, if there's like considerable heterogeneity across census divisions, they should like inductively discover that with enough data. And if there's not, then they won't. And that's partly why they can be more efficient than other approaches. Yeah.
I think there are two issues floating around now, right? One is whether region confounds the relationship. The other is whether the equalization intervention should be within catchment area. But so you're doing an intervention that's
within catchment area, I think would be, I don't know how you'd even
right.
That.
Right, but like you're doing it nationally, right? So I'm getting the student getting a random draw of school characteristics from just anywhere
From the margin, the marginal
distribution, right?
Yeah.
And so to the extent that there are regional differences in school quality across broader areas,
yeah,
I would intuit that this almost certainly overstates the effect of such a randomizing intervention, because a more realistic hypothetical intervention would be within
a smaller shift in distribution.
That's like within 20 miles of where I live.
Yeah, no, that's right. And we could also modify this distribution, this intervention, so that the draw of S is conditional on region or a whole set of different student characteristics, right? And that would get at a slightly different question, right? It would sort of be like if among students from a similar region and say with like similar baseline ability levels, which is maybe, I think also a theoretically relevant and important question, what would happen if we equalize the distribution of school characteristics, right? Like within those subpopulations. So that's something that I definitely plan to look at as this project evolves, and is in fact an easier quantity to estimate than this one. Okay, so so this just shows our estimate. So this is the difference between the observed and the post-intervention gap in reading test scores between kids from high and low poverty neighborhoods. And so, you know, under this intervention kind of resembling a strict school lottery, you know, we estimate that the achievement gap would decrease by about 4/100ths of a standard deviation, or by roughly, you know, 7 or 8%. So this is, I think, a non-trivial reduction, but I think it's quite a bit smaller than, you know, what's typically, I think, implied in policy discussions around school reform, and certainly in theoretical debates about the causes of place-based disparities in achievement. So here's one other post-intervention gap where here we're looking at a hypothetical intervention where we equalize only curricular content and instructional practices, while upstream factors like school composition and resources are controlled, and downstream factors like climate and effectiveness are allowed to respond naturally to this equalizing distributions of curriculum and instructional practices, which kind of like ensures equal access to the same teaching methods and content during first grade. And so, you know, here we estimate that this type of intervention would reduce the gap in reading test scores by, you know, an even smaller amount, only 4%, which is kind of, you know, bordering on, I think, you know, substantive but practical insignificance. And I think, you know, of all the, in our hierarchy of characteristics of schools that could practically be intervened upon, I think this is the set that would be easiest. Whereas, you know, changing school composition is logistically and ethically very difficult. Equalizing school resources is also complicated when we conceptualize it multidimensionally like we have. Whereas equalizing curricular content and instructional methods is, again, not easy, but it's a bit easier to imagine how that might happen practically. Yeah.
But isn't what this is all saying is that, like, community resources and like what is happening outside of school, and if we could more equally distribute income, or if we could provide early childhood services for everybody within the community, that is actually addressing what is impacting these gaps.
Yeah, so certainly one interpretation of these results is it's not the schools, it's something outside the schools, right? What exactly it is outside the schools, I can't say from these results alone, but what I can say is that there's not, the evidence here is far from overwhelming that differences in schools between high and low poverty neighborhoods are what's driving the observed gap in test scores between those groups. Does that make sense? Yeah.
But before we jump to, it's not the schools, it's outside of schools, there's a question of the unit of analysis too, right? Like, is it, should we be thinking about schools, or should we be thinking about classrooms where instruction happens? And the extent to which classrooms where instruction happens vary within and between schools and across neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Which I know you can't do that, so I'm not faulting the study for that, but it's important conceptually to make that distinction.
Yeah, so, you know, definitely the discussion section of this paper is going to have a lot of reflection on that, because I think when you read, you know, a lot of how people have written about this topic, you know, the way that schools, it seems like, are often conceptualized as these kind of homogenous things, at least in like the neighborhoods literature. And there's not a lot of attention to the fact that the same school, right, can provide a completely different learning experience to different students within it. So, so all I can say is that when thinking of a school more homogenously, right, there's not evidence that there's differences that way driving these things, but we can't really say anything about what's happening with schools. Yeah.
I'm kind of tempted to interpret your result where you have the compositional differences versus all of the other differences. I'm tempted to interpret those also as school instruction, and all those other features can also just be correlated with compositional, you know, school composition, right? So funding.
But in fact, they're not.
Well, funding is things like formula funding, right? Formula funding depends on the composition, not just of the school, but like students, right? So in some ways, there's funding that comes from, you know, IEPs, and then there's some funding that comes from, you know, merit, right? So it's difficult to interpret this result as isolated from, I mean, I guess this is what you're saying, right? Is isolated from the compositional effects, because so much is tied to composition.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so so that does make, I think we can still interpret this okay, and I still think that this is kind of interpretable, at least the intervention on instructional practices. But definitely, like, if I had shown you guys something like where we are equalizing distributions of resources, conditional on composition, those things make that a little bit trickier to interpret for sure. Yeah.
So you just said that what you think you're showing is that the story that the school is providing one experience for one kid and not another, like, that's not true.
No, I'm saying I don't know. I can't figure that out from these data. I don't know that that's not true. I think that's very likely true. How that would contribute to the gaps we observe, I think, is still just unknown.
Yeah, because it seems to me like the fact that the differences by composition remain suggest exactly that different kids are getting a different outcome from the same inputs. And so that, to me, you know, says things like, where's structural racism? It's like, where is, you know, again, the different community resources that are available for these kids, like all of these. To me, that's what this story is telling.
Yeah, I think that's what it's telling me too, which maybe, you know, I haven't concluded yet, but I think that, I think that what I hear you saying is that there's lots of other things going on in these kids' lives. Everything from like higher order structures to other stuff that I study, like early life exposure to environmental health hazards and how those are distributed unequally across neighborhoods, that are what's potentially driving these gaps. Like what I would say we can learn from these results is that schools on everything that the Department of Education thought to include on its main survey of elementary schools, you know, except for composition, doesn't differ all that much between neighborhoods, even though in the literature on neighborhood poverty and, you know, like pick up your, you know, issue of the Chicago Tribune, the assumption that they do is everywhere. And so I would say, one, I think that assumption is mistaken. It's not completely mistaken, but people are imagining greater differences than there are on many of these dimensions. And because that variability is fairly compressed when we try and estimate or like emulate the consequences of what would happen if we did equalize those different characteristics of schools. We're finding that not much, right? And so, you know, being very cautious, how I would interpret that is I would say that, like, look, schools don't differ as much across high and low poverty neighborhoods as is commonly assumed. And because of that, equalizing schools in different ways doesn't move the achievement gap very much. And those differences also don't contribute to the achievement gap very much. What is driving the achievement gap, I can't say exactly. It's something else in the neighborhood, right? Or these, or the difference between the families that live in different neighborhoods, right? That's driving the results, and not just differences in school environments. Right?
I'm afraid we are out of time. We've successfully interrupted you so much you didn't get to.